I'm going to talk about module design and development best practices, which is a really vague term because it's best practices as the vocal parts of the community can know it currently, or decided currently, I guess is probably the best description. How many people are not writing modules but are writing PowerShell? I think that's probably the best. Okay, so start writing modules, guys. The cliff notes. Yeah, bunch of stuff. I do DSC. I'm on Slack and GitHub, and yeah. If you're not on Slack, join the PowerShell Slack. It's great. We spend all of our hours on there. So, a quick agenda. Why this all matters. I can tell you all of the great technology behind all of this, but unless I tell you why it's important, it doesn't really mean much, and you can ignore it. We're going to have a quick look at function design, quick look at module structure options, some folder structure stuff, the joys of build scripts, which will scare all of the ops guys in the room, testing, which will scare everybody in the room, and documentation, because as much as we hate it, we have to write it. So why? Yeah, I see lots of talks, and they're really great, and they talk about some awesome technologies, but they don't really explain why you should use it, other than it's new and shiny, it's great, and the kind of the why is probably the more important one in my opinion. So I used to say we're developers. As soon as you write a script and hit save, you're a dev, which is true, but at the same time, it's not really nice to have that title, I guess is the right word. I work with devs. There's lots of joking animosity between devs and ops for various reasons, depending on which companies you work with and what devs you work with. But dev as a job title is a thing. Ops as an ops title is a thing, whatever your ops title is. But the better term I find, and having talked to a few people about this, is technologists, because it's more a descriptor of what we are or who we are. And we're people who care about the technology we work with, care about the things we do, passionate about those things, because if you weren't passionate about these things and cared about these things, you wouldn't be here today. You'd be sitting in the office doing whatever you do in the office, killing databases in Rob's case. Yeah. So it's all about caring about these things and trying to learn from the other communities and be better at it. It makes it easier for people to contribute. We've got all these best practices and how we should lay things out, and people come along and contribute code for you. That's less code that you have to write. You spend a couple of minutes reviewing it, make sure it's all right, but makes your life considerably easier if someone else is writing the code for you, as you see with lots of open source tools. DBA tools wouldn't be where it is today if it wasn't for the 100 and something people contributing on it. It makes it so much easier for people to use. This is a huge thing. You go into PowerShell, if I want to get some information out of something, the verb should probably be get. I know that everybody who starts using PowerShell very quickly learns these things. And if you stick to these sorts of conventions, everybody, especially your end users who are kind of the people who matter in all of this, their life becomes a lot easier and they complain at you less. And the less they complain at me, the better. So function design. We all write functions, probably, or we all write scripts that will very quickly become functions. So I'm going to ignore the usual, a function should do one thing and only one thing, because everyone learns that eventually. Output types are nice. You can put it on the descriptor at the top next to your command binding, and it stops script analyzer complaining at you, which it will keep doing. But it doesn't do anything other than put it in the help file to say, get help this. Oh, that's going to output this sort of object, which is really useful for AD. So if I say get AD user, then I know by checking the help that it's going to give me an AD user object. If I do get service, it's going to give me some random service object that comes from .NET. It's increasing the visibility of what you're going to return. You can do some interesting things with return objects in various places. And I know some people are working on working that into the pipeline so it'll detect things further down the line, but that's still work in progress. Always output objects using write output or just $variable on the line, and only output one thing, one type of object, please. Don't do write object and some random help information, like I'm getting some data from databases. Don't write output that, please. Write verbose, write debug, write information. If you really have to, write host. That's all information output. Don't put that into your pipeline stream. It will cause all sorts of wonderful problems. Commandlet binding is wonderful, and you should use it on almost every single function you write. It gives you things like dash verbose, dash error actions, and you can do a little bit extra to get your confirms and what ifs. But advanced functions are great. Please write them. It's literally like one line of code to make it an advanced function, and it gives you a dozen parameters or something. And pipeline input. We all work with PowerShell. We all know the joys of the pipeline, and enabling it is, again, a pretty simple thing to do. And if you do it on your sets, your updates, your removes, that sort of thing, then you can do the joys of get AD user, pipe it to people who aren't enabled because they've been disabled or they've gone for whatever. Pipe to remove AD user because I don't need those users anymore. You forget the way a bit, things get a little bit complicated as you wipe out AD, but you know, that's what backups are for. And just hope you get them before the replication hits. But yeah, pipeline input on your sets and updates, super useful. On your gets, you might as well if you're doing it, and it makes sense for you to have pipeline input there. An interesting one here is PS type name. So when you're creating your custom objects, they are of type PS custom object, assuming you're using PS custom object. And you can give it a type name, which can be any old garbage. Just a string that describes what it is. So I usually use module name dot whatever it is. So if it's a user, it's going to be module name dot user or module name dot switch if I'm returning switches. But it then means your functions later down in your module can accept these types of objects in. And that will make it a bit easier to pipeline things around, and you can do some extra wizardry around it. Another option for that is classes. So they can be quite useful if you know you're only going to support PowerShell 5 and onwards. You can generate your own classes that have specific types of properties in them, specific methods. Again, lets you pipeline these things around and lets you do some interesting constructor work on it. So you can say, pass a string to it and it'll just turn it into the right type of object for you. Fred did a great session at PowerShell Summit earlier this year about how to do classes as constructors for parameters, which is really interesting if you want to see that. Yeah, so the next two are a bit of an obvious one, and really it's like, it is the most difficult thing in computing is naming things and off by one errors. So please name things sensibly. I know it's difficult, but don't call things name if you've got like 3 different types of object that could have a name on them. Use the common names like computer name if you're going to accept computer names. Just be descriptive, because the next person to read your script might be you in 6 months' time who can't remember it, or it might be the next person who comes along and really hates you for the next 30 years for it. Someone was recently commenting that you should write all your code as if the next person to maintain it is an axe murderer who knows your address. So probably a good sort of boundary to work on. You know, if they're going to hate you that much, it's probably worth putting a little bit of effort in to think of a useful name for things. Yeah, function names, stick to verb-noun, even for your private stuff, just because it makes it easier to read. And that one day you're like, actually, I want to make this private function public now, and you have to rewrite a ton of code. So module structure. So we all start out this way with one giant PSM1 file that used to be a PS1 file, and we just changed the name on it because it was full of functions. They're great, super quick to load, like less than, like not even real milliseconds at this point. You just ship them around, no problem. Nice, simple files. But they're a bit of a bugger to maintain. Like at a certain point, they just become huge. The example I always give is PowerShell Get, as Reese was mentioning earlier. Brilliant module-ish. But until 6 months ago or so, it was one single PSM1 file. 16,000 lines of code in this file. Not the nicest thing to maintain. You're scrolling up and down a lot. You try to do merges on that from a couple of branches. It's just not pleasant at all. So lots of the community and various people came up with a solution, which was dot sourcing. We've probably all seen it. It's, so, get me all of the PS1 files under this folder structure, do dot, the file name, and off it goes. PowerShell does some magic in the background to run all those scripts in the current context, and all the functions are available. Your PSM1 file's like half a dozen lines, if that, and all of your functions are in lovely, easy files. Super easy to maintain. Git loves it. Lots of little files, merges are easy, everyone's happy. The problem is it's like ridiculously slow. Many, many, many times slower. So the difference here is what? 740 milliseconds. It's not a noticeable amount to end users, at least in this module, which has 30 or 40 functions. But you get to bigger modules like PowerShell Get, and it gets a lot more obvious. So they did this process of splitting it all up, and their import process was 12 seconds to do import module PowerShell Get. That's not only noticeable, that's kind of a pain. It's like, I'm going to have to wait a bit now. You do get command on that module. It takes 12 seconds to import it and figure out what all these commands are. DBA tools used to do this. I tested it on one of my machines, again, 6 months ago or so. It took me almost a minute to import it, and that's on like an i7 with a decent amount of RAM. Yeah, that's just, you do it once a day, who cares? You do that every single time you're spinning up machines and processes, that's just going to have a massive impact. And you have to sign every single one of these scripts. Who cares? That takes milliseconds. Build process handles that. But then the import process gets even slower as you have to check the CRL on every single one of these scripts. It goes from a minute of importing to 5 minutes, 10 minutes, who knows? A lot of time. So then we have to come up with, like, what's the alternative? These are kind of like the stepping stones you'll go through. So I call it compiled PSM1. It's probably the wrong word. It's a devy word. Concatenated is the other word I'm coming up with recently, where basically we take all of the contents of all of those PS1 files, which we keep in source control, perfectly like that, and jam them into the PSM1 file. Literally ship out, just take all of the text, drop them into one file. So you get all the benefits of having lots of little files. Source control loves it. Merges are easy. Everything's good. And then when you ship it out, it's one giant PSM1 file, which you don't care about because you never really look at that code, and your PSD1 file and other assorted files you ship out. It's a bit of a bugger to work with, at least initially, because you've got to automate this process, but it's like, again, a couple of lines of PowerShell. And if you have a problem with writing PowerShell to automate PowerShell, you've probably got the wrong sort of job working in PowerShell. Let's see how many more times I can say PowerShell in a sentence. But then you come back to this huge speed benefit that you get from a PSM1 file. So PowerShell Get, their wonderful 12-second import time dropped down to 2 seconds, which was a lot closer to what they initially had. Again, DBA tools do it now, and it's less than 10 seconds, considerably less than that, which is, going from a minute to less than 5 seconds is a nice amount of improvement I'm willing to see, and I'm willing to wait 5 seconds for a module that big to import. And smaller modules I work with day to day, not like less than 500 milliseconds, I'm never going to notice that. So around this, module manifest files. I know Reese mentioned this, but please always have a manifest file. They're really, really useful. They give you a ton of metadata about your module, and they give you a lot more control, and it's required if you're going to publish to a NuGet feed, like PowerShell Gallery or an internal one. The name of the manifest has to match the name of the module folder. It doesn't have to match the PSM1 file. It probably should, just to make it easier, but it doesn't have to. And please make sure it matches casing-wise as well. We live in a world where PowerShell is cross-platform. Linux cares about casing. And if the casing doesn't match, PowerShell will not import that module. Very, very important to make sure they match casing. Windows doesn't care, so you might as well just make sure it does match so that when people do use your module on other platforms, it works for them. Otherwise, you get a bunch of complaints and then you have to fix it, and yeah, it's a whole bunch of hassle. And don't use star when exporting functions, commandlets, aliases, all that stuff. It slows down the import process, and in things like constrained language mode and no language mode, the module will not import. There was a blog post about this recently where they were like, this is how it's designed to work. If you put a star there, we won't work with it. You have to be explicit about what you're exporting, which again, it's a piece of cake because we've got PowerShell for this. It'll update that, no problem. It's just a plain text file. So let's look at folder structure. We've got an idea of how our module should look in terms of the end user and within PowerShell, but how do we handle that in terms of actual files we work with day to day? This is the folder structure I've kind of settled on now. I have a VS Code folder because I use VS Code. It has a settings file in there for how I want my editor to interact, like where I want braces to go, when I want to do a formatting, that sort of thing. I've got a tasks.json or whatever it's called, which does lets me hit F5 and do stuff, basically. Docs, because we have to have docs. I have an output folder where all of my output goes. I'll go into that soon. I have a source folder. Sometimes it's called the same thing as the module's called. Sometimes it's called source. It doesn't really matter, whatever suits you. I know people who call it SRC. Some people prefer to call it the module. It doesn't bother me, whichever one you choose. Public and private, again, that can be internal, external, whatever you want. As long as it makes sense for, these are things the users will see, these are the things my module will use internally, and have that separation. My PSD1 file, which never changes, well, very, very rarely changes in source control. I might, I don't know, change the description, change the tags on it if I start doing extra stuff. But I'm not going to change the GUID, I'm not going to change the name, I'm not going to change a bunch of the stuff in there. I have tests because we need tests. I will get on that soon, but it's very, very important to have tests in here. I have a git ignore file because I'm using Git. You can use TFVC, SVN, Mercurial, whatever you want, but put your code in source control. I haven't said that enough already. I probably haven't said it all yet. But if your code is running in production or is going anywhere near production, that code goes in source control. Because how do you know what changed since the last time you ran that code? You need to be able to do the diffs and all of that good stuff. But my git ignore is set to basically ignore my output folder and any other random files I'm likely to change. I have a depend file, which is for a module called ps-depend. It lets me handle all the various dependencies I have for build time and stuff like that. I have my build.ps1 file. That's what I will get on in a second, where it does all my build magic. The license file is completely, not necessary if you're only developing internal things. If it's only ever going to be used internally, you don't really need a license. You probably should put one there anyway, whatever your company license is, but you don't need it. If you're doing open source, or it's likely to go open source, you need a license file. If you don't have a license file, no one can or will use your module at all. It's just not allowed, basically. Well, it's allowed, I guess, if they want to, but you know, it's without a license, they can't really use it legally. And a README because, again, docs are important, guys. Just detailing your module, how to build it, that sort of thing. It's a whole bunch of effort to set this up. It takes me a few minutes every time I spin up a new project to make all these folders. Templating systems, Plaster's really reasonably good. PS module development by Fred is really good and does tons of stuff that Fred does with these things where you get like huge monolithic frameworks that probably does more than it needs to. But again, really cool tools for automating this nonsense so you don't have to do it yourself. But I keep doing it myself because I haven't bothered doing that automation. which I know, I'm sorry, Rob, but yeah, one day I will. Yes, yeah. So, quick note on general good practice. Version stamping your module. We should all do it. It shouldn't be 1.0.0.0 all of the time. Whether you go 3-part or 4-part or 2-part, doesn't really matter. But your major version number should only ever change if there are breaking changes. So we see this a lot with DSC resources. Some of their version numbers crank up ridiculously. SQL Server DSC, I think, went through 3 or 4 major versions in the same number of months, as people are just like, here's a breaking change, here's a breaking change. But again, that's good. It means that the system's working. The major version number only changes with breaking changes. Minor version number can change on bug fixes, new features, anything that's not breaking current functionality. If your major version 0, then you're kind of in a beta stage, so do whatever you want, but warn your users well ahead of time that there are breaking changes going to happen. And revision number, the rest of the numbers aren't particularly useful to end users and are more for your own internal purposes. We use however many times the builds run as our revision number. So if it's taking me 15 builds to get to a stable build, then it's 1.0.15. That's just how it is. Doesn't really matter. This last point is quite an important one. If you're creating functions, please don't name them the same as things that are core functionality of PowerShell. If you want to do that, call it something different, like something related to your module, and then create an alias from the original one. So I ran this on a big project I was doing recently, where someone had thought it was a really good idea to create a function called outDefault, which if no one's encountered outDefault, you're probably not going to, because it's kind of a silent one that no one ever sees. So at the end of every single pipeline, there is a call to outDefault. You never see it, it just happens. And it's part of the PowerShell.core something or other. It's like a part of the snap-in. Brilliant function, does just put stuff out to wherever the default thing is. Usually the screen, could be anywhere. But the problem is, if you create a function called outDefault and then unload that module, that function goes away. Which is, whatever, who cares? Except because the original outDefault's in a snap-in, that doesn't get auto-imported the next time it's called. So now I try to run anything, and my pipeline's like, what's outDefault? I can't do anything with it. So now my console's dead, and I have to close it and reopen it, and I've lost everything that I was doing in that state. A little bit of a bugger, particularly on that project as I was importing every single module in the PowerShell gallery. Yeah, it takes a little while to import that. Yes, it takes a little while to open that console, like 30, 40 seconds at least. Yeah, fun times, so don't do that, guys. Aliases, they're the best. Let's get on to the build scripts bit. So this is very devy talk. Build scripts is the word it is. It's just how I talk about it because I work with devs. There are probably more opsy talk words for it, but yeah. So invoke, build, and Sake are brilliant tools. Pure PowerShell task runners. You can give them things to do and do dependencies and all sorts of things. Nice and simple. It's just PowerShell code. I think everyone here can write PowerShell, can they? Anyone who can't, other than Rob? You've got tools like Azure Pipelines, AppVeyor, GitLab, Jenkins. There's probably a dozen more that I've forgotten about because there's so many of them. But it's all about automating this whole process. And it literally, my actual process is a bit more than just 3 steps because I've got a bunch of versioning and other stuff around it. But the 3 core things you need to do are take all of those lovely PS1 files you have, jam the content into a PSM1 file, doing literally get content, add content, test your code, and making sure you run your tests against the PSM1 file. Not against the PS1 files, against the PSM1 file. And then script analyzer, the same thing. So the important thing here is testing against the PSM1 file. Because if you don't, and you test against your PS1 files, you're not testing what you're shipping to customers and end users. You think, yeah, of course I am. I'm testing the PS1 files. You're doing some add content stuff. Nothing's really changing. But the interactions between all those functions and how that module's imported is very different from having a single PS1 file. I had a conversation with someone last night who saw this talk previously and was like, yeah, I'm really, really glad you told me to test those PSM1 files because I found a problem in production that I wouldn't have found by testing the PS1 files because of interactions with where script scope variables or something else was in the way, causing this problem that you never detect otherwise until you test against the PSM1 file. It's hugely important. And if you learn nothing else, please test your finished product before you ship it, not the stuff you're doing in the middle. And this whole process is an hour's worth of work to set up, probably less once you've done it once. Yeah, and I press F5 now in VS Code, and it just runs this whole process, and it takes me 30 seconds to a minute for me to test all of my code, which is generally easier than shipping it all off to production and then breaking tons of stuff and having people come and complain at me. So testing. It's difficult. From ops perspective and people who aren't used to writing tests, it is very difficult to do. But Pest is your friend. Awesome tool. Again, test against PS1. If you find a bug, write the test, run it to make sure it fails. Write half a dozen tests if you have to get all of the use cases around that area, and then fix it. And then run your test to make sure you've actually fixed it and think they've fixed it. But yeah, it's difficult, and there's a ton of awesome content out there about Pesta and how to run the tests. There's the Pesta book on Lean Pub. There's a bunch of great sessions from PowerShell Summit this year, PSConf EU. Jakob did some really good sessions at PSConf Asia as well, because he's the lead maintainer of Pesta now. Glenn Sarti and Brian Bunky did some great sessions at PS Summit. And your tests should sit with your code, and they will evolve as your code evolves. There's whole things like TDD and all sorts of things around it, but just write some tests to make sure your code does what you think it should do. Run it. If it doesn't, then fix one of them. Probably your code, because your tests should be pretty accurate. And it's a form of documentation. It means that when someone else comes along to maintain your code, they can run the tests first and look at the tests and say, okay, this function is supposed to do these things. Well, the code doesn't actually do those things, but the test is still passing. I should fix the code so it actually does that. Probably put a couple of other tests in there, that sort of thing. And my notes here say, you'll never write perfect code, which is true. I don't think I've seen anyone who ever written perfect code the first time, or the 100th time, or many times in between. Documentation. Yes. So we're all IT people, I assume, and no one really likes writing documentation. It's really boring. Like, writing code, super fun. Solving problems, great. Writing up how I did it and how users should use this, yeah. It's awful, but you have to do it. Please write your documentation. Platypus is great for generating the MAML files, which get shipped with your code as XML files. It's unless you like writing XML, in which case, have fun. MAMLs are like a weird, horrible version of XML, but yeah, Platypus will take your comment-based help or your markdown files and turn them into an XML file you can ship with your code. Makes life a lot easier. And we'll turn your comment-based help into markdown files, so you can publish them to wikis and read the docs and a bunch of other sites that support markdown to HTML. An important lesson, and a comment I always make is something Rob mentioned a few times, is teach your users about get help. Like, we all love get help. We all use it a lot, right? Along with get command and the other one. Get member, that's the fella. Use it a ton, forget its name. But if you teach your end users who are using this about get help, then they're going to eventually come to you less often. Because if they come up to you and say, how does this function work? You go, well, run get help and then the function name. And they go, oh, okay, I'll give that a try. And after the 6th, 7th, 50th time, they'll eventually run that first, then have their problems, and then come to you. And if there's a problem with the documentation, you can fix it. Or they can fix it. You know, it's front-loading the effort as much as possible so that you're helping them is mostly run get help. And then eventually they will figure all this out, probably. About pages are great. I'm sure we've all run get help about something and getting a ton of information about it. Really good for complicated details about your module, about certain classes in your module, anything that's not really going to fit. isn't necessarily suitable for a normal function help file can go in an about file. So interesting talks about documentation that I saw was Michael Lombardi did an awesome talk at PowerShell Summit this year discussing the many, many, many ways to do documentation. There are more of them than you could possibly imagine or think of ahead of time. Great talk, definitely worth watching online. And Vos, the guy who helps write Platypus, Sergey, something or other, he's written a really cool CI pipeline, which takes your markdown files and then makes sure they're actually valid markdown files, have the correct spelling in them, have the right URLs in them are actually URLs. So you can do CI testing on your documentation before it hits production or anywhere near that, which is yet another level of validating what you're doing. So let's do some quick demos because I've probably got time for that. So this helps if I do duplicate. That's fine. Let's do something that hurts people's eyes. Yeah, it's demos. You gotta use light theme, unfortunately. So I have this lovely function here called getUserData. Nice and generic. Takes a string. I have my output type, so script analyzer doesn't complain at me. And script analyzer is a static analysis tool that will tell you all of the problems that is in your code. Most of the problems that are in your code. It'll tell you things like using the wrong verbs or using unapproved verbs, if you're not outputting data, if you're using all sorts of random problems, it will just highlight for you. If you're using VS Code, it just does that automatically. If you're using the PowerShell extension. If you're not, install the PowerShell extension. If you're not using VS Code, consider using VS Code or one of the other new editors like Atom or Sublime or the ones that support this sort of stuff. The ISE is basically dead at this point. So I have this lovely object that gets output with a name, a domain, email address, a computer, and a type name. So the good thing is this type name will never appear in my output. So if I do getUserData, I always go with sensible names. So I can see, I can get some nice output. I can now use that elsewhere. So now let's say I want to set the user data. So I want to modify these users in some way. Let's just quickly load this into the session. So again, command binding, super useful. I will show that in a second. So I'm taking pipeline input because, again, it's a set command. It should probably accept pipeline input. But I've got two options. I can either take in a custom user data object, like the one I'm outputting, or I can take in a string. And because it's accepting pipeline input, it'll handle me passing it 15 of them, or one of them, and it'll just do it automatically. If I'm passed a custom object, it'll do something to it. I'm being a little sneaky. If I'm passed a single string, what I'll do is I'll call the one that gives me that type of object, and then call myself again with that object. Because why duplicate code if I don't have to? So if I do set user data name Dave, same thing, but now it's done what my command is doing, which is changing the computer name. Hopefully in real life it would do actually more than that, but yeah, demo purposes. So the really cool thing with command binding is that with no effort at all, I've added verbose, debug, like just a ton of extra functionality that I can make use of in my function if I wanted to. So verbose is great for giving extra logging that tells the user where things are up to. Because I'm using pipeline input, I can do things like this. Set user data. And it automatically knows, oh, I've got 3 objects coming down the pipeline. I'm going to process them one at a time. And then magically, apparently all 3 of them are using server 1. That's the benefits of generic code. So that's quite easy how you do pipeline input, command binding, all of those really easy things to do, and it gives you a ton of functionality and replicates what PowerShell does on all of its other commandlets. So it makes that discoverability for end users really, really easy. So if I say a get command, I know it's going to return me data. It shouldn't also be hacking away at my AD domain or reformatting my C drive. Fun note: format is a great verb. You've got format list, format table, format disk. Yeah. Not quite sure the sensible thoughts on that one. Build scripts. So I discussed roughly what they are, but here's an example. Let's close this because it's not really useful. So there's a ton of stuff in here that isn't really necessary to worry about, so I do some PS depend stuff first, which basically makes sure I've got all my dependencies in the right place. I'm doing some stuff with changing locations here because one of my projects needs that. For the most part, you probably don't care. I'm finding the root PSD1 file. So if I have lots of PSD1 files in this folder because I'm using them as general config data files, I need to make sure I'm finding the right one. So I do some basic regex to look for root module. It's highly unlikely I'm ever going to use the word root module in a non-manifest file. Do some magic with figuring out where paths should go. Basically, everything should end up in my output folder. I remove any existing file that's in my output folder. That's called .psm1 in this case. So if I look at so my PSM1 file literally does not exist in this repository because I don't care. I could create an empty one, but it would be pointless because I'm going to recreate it brand new every time I run this build. I find all of my functions that are public and private, and then literally just iterate over all of them, get content from that file, add content to the other file. And then same again for public functions. I do some wizardry to figure out what the function's actually called. So in theory, my file should be called exactly the same thing as my function's called. So getUserData will be in a file called getUserData.ps1. But I'm an idiot, my coworkers are human, but there's going to be times when we update the file name but don't change the function, or change the function name but don't update the file name. So I'm going to assume the function is actually called what it should be called, and the file could be called anything.ps1. So I look for that and make sure I grab just the function name. Again, assuming verb noun, because it's public functions, so it should be. Put a nice simple export module member at the bottom of my PSM1 file. And then I use a module called configuration to update my functions to export. Because again, I don't want that to be star. I want that to be explicitly set to only the functions that I want my users to see. And then I run some pester, and I run some script analyzer. Again, making sure I target that built PSM1 file. So if we want to see that in action, so this is going to need to be a lot bigger. Properties. It's probably big enough. That didn't really do much, but okay. So if I run /build the PS1 file, so it's going to run off to PS depend first. There's a whole big pile of output for this. Basically, if I already have these modules locally, PS depend's like, I don't care, you've got the right versions, let's keep going. Unfortunately, it has to do this for every one of them. I've got 4 or 5 dependencies in here, which are pester, platypus, script analyzer. For this one, I think I've got PS framework and a module for handling IP addresses and networking stuff. Okay, this should probably finish by then, if we're lucky. There we go. So now it's taken all of my PS1 files, dumped them in a PSM1 file, and it's running my tests. And I've got this built into VS Code as well, so I just hit F5 because that's what all the cool devs do. So I wanted to steal their idea. Yeah. Running all my tests, and I've got some in here. I can't remember how many in this version of the module. And again, writing tests is a bit of a pain, but you can very easily build these up. So I've got 160 tests that have passed there. That take me 2 or 3 weeks to write all of that, but I was writing them as I was writing the module. And then script analyzer tells me I'm calling something that should change the system state. I know it's not really going to, so I can put an exception in for that, but It's telling me now, you need to look at this and fix it. And that took me 1 minute and 14 seconds to do that. Thanks to the wonderful DBA tools prompt thing that does that. So that's all there is to a build script, really. Throw a bunch of files together, run pest on it, run script analyzer on it. There's a whole bunch of text here, but I'm mostly just being very certain I'm getting the things I need. So is F5 going to do what I wanted to do here? No, of course it's not. Yeah. Luckily, I don't have that many slides. So, questions. I suspect we don't have time for questions, so we'll catch me later on. I'm happy to talk about.
Where can we find your code?
Yeah, all my code's on my GitHub, as are the slides and everything else. This version of the deck's kind of like a living version of the deck, so it changes a lot. But I've got one from PSConf Asia that's more fixed from a few weeks ago. I'm on Twitter, I'm on GitHub, I'm on Slack. If you're not on PowerShell Slack, join the PowerShell Slack, it's great. We answer all sorts of questions and just generally talk all day. Some of us for far more hours than we really should be. Okay. Yeah, that's good. So thank you very much. Yeah.